Hello and welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning. I'm pleased to welcome our speakers this evening, artist and designer Megan Eccles and assistant professor of urban design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, Dana McKinney-White. Without further ado, Dana and Megan, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. So today, Megan and I would like to present a project that we've been working on. And it's really about notions of stillness and leveraging community-informed design practices, as well as different approaches of engagement to really inform the design for which we were to move forward with. Just a little bit more of an introduction. Megan and I folded Enfold Collective in 2021 as an interdisciplinary practice and really looking to position community voices first and central to the designs that we would later engage. We use stakeholder engagement as well as collaborative design approaches to propel our thinking as well as to uplift the voices of underrepresented and under-resourced communities. We really tout that we look towards an innovative model that also promotes beautiful aesthetics. And we're looking at trying to change the design praxis more broadly. And part of the reason why we started Enfold was because we were resistant, I think, in part to the way that design has been practiced historically. This is a picture of the Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier, who is one of the high modernists in the early 20th century. And this picture is like many among architects at the time, where you see often a white male inserting their hand into a model. And these practices were really based off of sort of a design focus without really a community in mind in particular. And so looking at how we can step back from the model, how we can look towards who our constituents are and putting them first. And just to kind of go through what a typical design process looks like, most architectural projects start with a concept design, schematic, design development, construction documents, and construction administration phases, where you might have community feedback trickle into those first 2 or 3 phases. And I would say that might is a pretty big might. There's a lot of projects that never actually have any sort of engagement whatsoever. They may or may not be required by the municipality that the project is taking place in. And so there's really not a lot of accountability to anyone beyond the client specifically. And one of the things that we are hyper aware of in our practice is this notion of implicit bias. Myself, Megan, everyone on this call right now has implicit bias. And these biases really do impact and shape the way in which we design and shape physical spaces. This can look like public housing and the way that we have leveraged certain policies. It can affect the way that we design for certain schools based off of socioeconomic brackets, the conditions of streets and the types of streetscape improvements that are done, tree and equity shading throughout the different city environments. And so these biases really are something that we're trying to challenge within ourselves and then also push back as we're engaging new design processes. Just a few examples of some bad outcomes of where an architect or planner has kind of had their hand in the model, but has been a little bit complicit in the ways in which in their accountability towards community members. So Pruitt-Igoe is a housing project, for example, in St. Louis, Missouri, which housed thousands of people in these modernist block residential buildings. The project has since been deconstructed in part because of poor maintenance and abundance of crime that was happening on and around the site. But these projects were housing predominantly Black and Brown community members, but never really engaged those community members to begin with. Ponte City in Johannesburg, South Africa, is another housing development that is a skyscraper where you have all these housing units that are facing in towards a singular courtyard space, which allowed for very, very poor daylighting access, almost a sort of a panoptic situation where people could see into other people's units, and subsequently has been decommissioned from its use because of the way that it didn't necessarily meet the needs of its community members. And then Hudson Yards is a very recent example in New York, where you see an overabundance of wealth and opulence, especially in this particular structure. But you have a bunch of residential and commercial and office uses that are very, very much targeted towards a certain clientele, often very wealthy. And the project leveraged money in hopes of bringing in community benefit through a visa program that would basically take high net worth individuals, foreigners who wanted to come to the United States to create contributions towards development projects. And to do so, you have to fit within a zone or a territory that has an income and a job threshold. And to be able to have this particular project qualify for that, there's a very extreme gerrymandered map that would then bring in Hudson Yards and connect it almost to a singular line to parts of Harlem, specifically connecting it to positions of public housing. And so we, as a practice, are really trying to look at the methods in which designers historically have pursued projects, how they've allowed projects to be enabled and realized, and really want to challenge ourselves to not push or position ourselves in the same capacity. And so we're looking to change the process. I mean, it's probably not even as linear as this, but while we have the five design phases that you typically would have, we're looking at starting earlier with community engagement, and in community engagement that is continuous and ongoing, and that continues beyond the constraints of the project. We are hopeful that this engagement helps to feed each of our design phases and then continues to push the project forward. And so this brings us to the definition of community-informed design. We're looking at how to leverage community engagement as well as a data-driven approach to envision a project centering community needs and desires. Our engagement methods include a number of things. These are just a few of them, but it includes in-person and online meetings, surveys, interviews, both semi-structured and unstructured, focus groups, intercept studies, and social media engagement. We realize we have to meet people where they are, and not everyone's in the same place or has the same availability. And so giving ourselves, the space to introduce ourselves, to prepare the community for the project, to get the feedback and to have that ongoing engagement and really build a relationship with community members. So we're going to share with you all a project that we've been working on this past year that we worked in conjunction with an organization called Materials and Applications, or M&A for short. So M&A is a nonprofit based in Los Angeles, California, that works alongside emerging design practices and artists to do large-scale art installations across the city and the county, more broadly speaking. The organization started about 20 years ago, and they've completed a number of projects. And one of the things that their mission has been that the projects are always free and open to the public. So I just wanted to share a few examples of what those previous projects look like. Some of them have been as small as, the size of a kitchen table, whereas others are much more immersive. They use different courtyards that have been made available to them, storefronts, a number of different environments. And so when we were first engaged to work on the project with them, we were given the space of the Craft Contemporary Courtyard. And the idea behind this is similar to that of MoMA PS1 in New York City, in which you have an existing art institution that has an adjacent courtyard, and during the summer months to activate that courtyard with a large-scale work. The Craft Contemporary is a relatively small institution that sits on Wilshire Boulevard, known as Miracle Mile in Los Angeles, California. It's situated right across the street from the La Brea Tar Pits and down the street from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, known as LACMA, as well as the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures and the Peterson Automobile Museum. And so it's in a site in a neighborhood that is sort of a cultural hub for the city of LA, even though it in itself is one of the smallest institutions on the street. So this is what the Craft Contemporary looks like from the street. It's a sort of old Victorian-esque house that's been converted into a museum and modified over time and painted. It has kind of a quirky atmosphere. And as you can see, there are a number of things in the courtyard that became of consideration for us as we were working on the project. the museum itself has a mural covering its front facade, which is quite vibrant. This white, black, and yellow facade, and then they've introduced signage that's kind of projecting into the public atmosphere. And so this facade was something that we couldn't necessarily ignore given how busy it is. The museum is very proud of it, and so they wanted whatever work would be adjacent to it to kind of complement that facade. It also gives it quite a unique character as compared to the rest of the sort of more modern facades that you'll see on Wilshire Boulevard. So here's a view or two views of the courtyard space, which I think is a bit chaotic to say the least, and something that when we first arrived on site, we're like, "Woo, that's a lot." There's a ramp that is necessary to bring in large scale artworks. There is an elevator that was added on that's kind of jutting out at this kind of odd angle. The courtyard itself funnels as it moves towards the back of the space. There's a large scale art piece that is these steel columns and beams that are standing, but they look like they could be structural, but they don't really have any purpose. And then there's a series of benches and brick. And so there's all these different textures. There's a lot of different things that are taking place. There's stains on the floor, which I'll mention shortly. There's just a lot going on. To start our process, before we even put any pen to paper, we immediately met with the Craft Contemporary staff as sort of our first engagement. And part of the thing that we wanted to understand from them was, as people who are here every day, who are operating the museum, what do you guys want? And what are the things that are of concern to you in the past when you've had installations or things that you guys really want to, put forward? And one of the number one pieces of feedback we got was that it's really hot in the courtyard. It's very, very hot, especially in the summer. There's no shade, and they have events in the courtyard on a weekly basis. And so it was also important that we have access for those events, and ideally have some shade for them. One thing that they were very adamant about was that there was no plants in the installation, which was something we were kind of, I think, hopeful for or looking forward to introducing, given how sort of hard the rest of the courtyard was. But they just didn't have the staffing to be able to maintain those plants. And then the last thing that they were very I guess honest about was the fact that they needed that ramp, that really wide ramp, because they bring in large scale artworks on a regular basis. And so that there needed to be maintained access to that ramp. And so we started thinking about early design inspiration. And in this case, we were looking and thinking a lot about that yellow on the front facade. And then also thinking a bit about sort of the sunsets, the iconic LA sunset. And we're thinking about how can we bring in color as a way to unify the space, and also through something that would become a shade structure. So our initial design idea was to create a shade structure that would basically gradient from a yellow to a really vibrant orange and evocative of the LA sunset, and that would hang above, sort of regulated by a singular datum, and modulate based off of where you were in the courtyard. And maybe there would be higher elements based off of communal gathering spaces and lower elements that you might have to walk and navigate through. And the staff really enjoyed this, so we very quickly moved on to sort of a more technical design exploration and trying to figure out like the spacing of this shade structure, which we envisioned to be a series of fabric panels, which we were planning on hanging from the Craft Contemporaries roof and then the adjacent neighbors' balustrade, which they had. We did a mock-up. This is a relatively inexpensive mock-up that we did of my roof at home. And we're trying to figure out like how much fabric we would need, what the density of the fabric would be, to be able to create sort of the gradation of color we were hoping to achieve, what that fabric would do over time relative to weather and solar exposure. And then we met our first major hiccup. Our next door neighbors were not particularly friendly to the idea or keen to the idea of us using their balustrade or this metal bar above here to suspend the fabric off of. We even worked with a structural engineer who very clearly explained and it described how it wouldn't affect the structure itself, but they were not amenable to this design. And so we had to go back to the drawing board. And this time we decided to take a cue from the local context. And so we started looking a bit across the street, which was the tar pits, the La Brea tar pits, which are famous for being sort of this archaeological site for excavations. But the site is also filled with ponds that are filled with tar that is quite stinky. It's very hot. The courtyard in the Craft Contemporary actually has off-gassing pipes for its own methane exposure to kind of help bring the gas away from the ground because it does have quite a fragrance. But we were really interested in this idea of tar, which is dark, black, it's shiny, it's sticky, and the way that it actually has taken place within this site. So on site, there are stains of tar everywhere, where tar literally starts to seep between the cracks of the concrete. People step in it from when they're crossing the street, and they bring it into sight. But it has this tactile and visual resonance across the courtyard. And at the same time, this is also being designed and envisioned during the height of the pandemic and other sorts of health scares that are going around internationally. We're also dealing with racial reconciliation and the murder of George Floyd, concerns of gender rights, equity, and women's reproductive rights, political disjunction. And I think overall there was a sense of social pessimism. And so our conversations with materials and applications, as well as the Craft Contemporary and amongst ourselves, had really started to change. And I think the chaos that was happening in the world was evocative of the chaos that was indicative of this courtyard. And so we were really trying to think about ways in which we can respond to stress, isolation, clutter, visual noise that was that would be healing and meditative and contemplative. So these are just some early sketches of what that space could be. And that brought us to our notion of stillness. Stillness as being a sense of calm, as having silence, having a sort of monotony and a recognizability, also to make things quiet. And so for us, we were in hope of achieving a form of stillness with the design, with the architecture. We came up with a whole new iteration, a whole design, which we would then call Black Still. And this is sort of an early watercolor sketch to kind of show what we were hoping to achieve. And you might say, why black? Well, we think of black as being a color that's of contemplation. In a sense, it can be calming for some. It's this darkness. It's like your eyes are shuttered. It's also subversion of whiteness. Megan and I, it's no surprise, are two Black female designers, and we are surrounded by whiteness in a space of design. We're surrounded by white models, white walls. There's sort of a fixation of whiteness in a way. And so I think this was presenting us an opportunity for us to celebrate Blackness in that it can be clean and it's not sterile. It could be pure, but not absolute. And it can be good without flaws. And then in addition to that, we felt that the Black would help to kind of contrast the rest of the chaos of the courtyard, pick up on some of those colored themes from the front facade, and help to unify and calm and still that space. The initial installation that we designed was going to be a plywood black box, and which we were going to have what we called a portal, so a space that which you would walk through before you got inside the primary space. And then once you entered the main room, there would be an aperture to the sky. And along that aperture, this opening in the ceiling, there would be a misting system. And the reason why we wanted to introduce this misting system was in two parts. One, to help naturally cool the space inside the volume, just because it is very hot in LA during the summer. And then the other was in hope of creating a sort of a prismatic effect when you had the mist hitting the sky and the sun. And in addition to that, we started to think about what does it look like for us as Black female design practitioners to create a space with given all these sorts of social concerns. And we really decided that we wanted the space to be designed by Black people for Black people, specifically Black Angelenos. And to help the community heal in light of all these different stressors that were happening in the world, the idea was to bring in meditative and contemplative practices, wellness practices specifically, such as yoga and meditation, sound baths and Reiki, restorative justice, land acknowledgements, so that we could introduce wellness practices to communities of color, specifically Black community members, who may or may not have had that exposure before. So I'm going to pass it over to Megan.
Thank you. From that initial design that we created, we moved on to design charrettes. So design charrette is kind of a fancy term that's used in architecture and design and art practices, as well as planning. And that's where we invite people in to look at designs at an intermediary stage. And this places fresh sets of eyes, and they're able to critique and challenge our initial design assumptions. And that way we bring new perspectives to the design. So at Enfold, we try to bring in community voices at this step, as well as bringing in design professionals to give us their ideas and respond to what we've created. For this project, specifically Black Steel, we included members of materials and applications, ourselves, and then the program practitioners. So previously, Dana was mentioning those different practices of like yoga, meditation, dance. So we went out and found teachers, asked them if they would like to work with us and possibly hold a workshop in the next year. And then if they would like to participate in a charrette where we show them the design and they respond to it. So for the next few slides, I'm going to show some examples of what we showed to the participants of the design charrettes. So we introduced the initial materials. So the Black plywood that Dana mentioned for the exterior. We had a smooth pebble for the ground material. We knew that in order to dampen some of the road noise, because Miracle Mile is pretty busy, we want to use insulation to dampen the sound, to make it a much more quiet place, a meditative place. And then we also had the misting system. And then from there, we posed different questions, like the ones listed below, and asked them to respond. So in order to prompt them to respond to the designs. So what are other senses that we can engage, or how are we not engaging senses? Can you imagine what the structure is being made of, and should it be made of any other material? Or how do you feel about the material that we proposed? We also introduced the form of the installation. So here is kind of a section or a cut in through the building of the previous images that you saw. And then we also asked them questions about, does the cube feel appropriately sited? You'll see that there's a tunnel that blocks the interior view where you can pass through it from the street and then enter into the main void. Describe how you react to that structure. Is there a difference of calmness or anxiety if you imagine yourself in that space? So it was a very imaginative process when going through the design charrette. We also asked the practitioners to think of their own practices and how they would be engaging with people that came to participate in their workshops. So what a yoga teacher would need would be different from what a meditation teacher may need or a dance practitioner. So how many people could you imagine being in the space with you? How can we better facilitate a space for you as a design or art practitioner? So because the entire process was bi-coastal, we utilized online communication and tools to hold the charrettes. So basically we did them over Zoom. So November 19th of 2022 was the first charrette, and we utilized Miro, which you'll see a screenshot of one of our Miro boards from the first charrette. And Miro is a multifunctional online whiteboard tool, and that allows people to access the documents and basically visually brainstorm all together. The second charrette, we took the feedback from the practitioners and all those different questions that we asked and input that they gave us, took a step back, and this is where you'll see the form starts to change. So you can see on the three bottom images that the tunnel in the front of the installation becomes blocked off at one side. And this puts the user on more of a guided journey throughout the space. It's intended to create tension and a reduction of light before entering into the main open interior, where it would open up and be more light and bright inside. So also during the charrette, we highly discussed the flatness of the Black plywood that was positioned as the initial exterior. And we wanted to make things feel more warm, more inviting, more domestic. So as we revised the design, we landed on the historic process for walls that's known as lath and plaster. So here's an image of traditional lath and plaster, and this would be what's on the interior of a home that has plaster walls. And so we used this technique and reversed it in order to create a facade and motif or texture. And the interesting thing is that once it is coated in a Black finish, it starts to look more like the tar that's protruding through the cracks of the sidewalk and the cracks of the street and kind of bubbling through. So it really gave the project more context in relationship to the site. So this is a close-up image of the lath and plaster on the left side. And then on the right side of the screen, we have the ground cover, or a close image of the ground cover. And ultimately, we wanted to have something that would be softer than the pebble, but still have that same kind of reflectiveness as far as shine, and then also responsiveness as far as something that would shift underfoot. And the rubber mulch ground cover that we ultimately ended up using was basically playground cover, or what you would see at a lot of playgrounds. So you see this material playground, so it's super safe. It's also ADA accessible. And here's a view of the aperture or opening at the top of the interior of the installation. We knew we wanted to line the opening with mist, as Dana mentioned, and that created the cooling effect that we were going to have. And as Dana mentioned, there would be some sort of rainbow prismatic effect. And I think that we wanted this not only to be a cooling device, but also kind of a poetic device. And you're being in this Black space, but then you're also being filled with this notion of optimism with the rainbow. And this is the entire revised project after going through the process of the design charrettes. And at this point, we were confident that this is what we wanted to provide to the public with materials and applications. And in course, in order to build anything, we need money. I'm not sure. Dana probably mentioned that we were given a budget of $20,000 initially. But of course, this is during the pandemic, and this is when everyone saw everything inflate. So we needed more money. And we basically went out and worked and found more money. So we ultimately got about $52,000 for our project to be able to build this project. Most of that money coming from grants, some of it coming from crowdfunding, private donations, and then also in-kind donations through donated materials. So then we started the building process the next year. Due to the museum's coordination of events. So like Dana mentioned, they like to have events and workshops at this museum. And then they also were doing new shows on the inside. So we had a very limited timeline on when we could build this project. And that only gave us 12 days to build the project. And also the installation is 12 feet tall for reference. So you can imagine building anything that's 12 feet tall in 12 days, like how short of a timeline that is. We relied on a LA-based Black women-owned contractor by the name of Builder B to construct the frame of the project. And you'll see on the left side of the page, this is us with the Builder B team taking a photo on the last day that they constructed the frame. And from there, it was on us to attach small strips of wood to the frame. And that's on the right side. To do this, it was a lot of our own labor. We had volunteers, lots of friends. And then we also, the interesting thing is people were very fascinated from the street on what are you doing? What are you building? As well as seeing things on social media, wondering what are we doing and what we're building. So this is just an image of Dana showing some people from the street what we plan to do. And of course, we received more hiccups. So there are some unhoused neighbors, of course, in Los Angeles, and then along the site, including to the rear of the site, there are some people who live in the alleyway for now. And they were also interested in our project, of course, friendly with us, but then sometimes some tools or materials would walk away, and we definitely have to interact with people and get them on our side and get them to maybe give us a bag of mortar back or a pack of wood back in order to continue on with our project. So this is the second half of the building process. You see the mortar being pushed through the lath in that fashion that I was showing in the few slides earlier, as well as like painting the project. And painting the project, you can see even in the background of the image on the right, there are some walls that are unfinished that we were still painting and working along with the mortar as we went. Okay, and this is the final installation. And you can see it in context with the Craft Contemporary Museum. And we had this box basically tucked under the existing beamworks. And it really fit well into the context and space of the existing buildings and all of the chaos amongst the courtyard. A view from the rear where you can see the rubber mulch ground cover and how we shaped it around and kind of graded it up along the ramp and along the courtyard space. And here are some detailed images of the final materials. We chose a glossy black that will be kind of referencing again the tar pits. But it really worked out well with the rubber mulch, which is the ground up tires on the ground. And it had this like level of reflectivity. On the top right corner, there is an image of the interior or a close shot of the interior. And this is basically a geotextile mesh, and it has pieces of fabric. And so for all the participants or viewers who came through the museum and came to the installation, they were invited to take a piece of fabric and then tie that on as a meditation and as a way of leaving something behind, essentially, at Black Steel. A few more images of Black Steel. And then you'll see on the interior image, as the process goes on or as the installation is up for more time, more and more fabric strips get adhered to the wall and it kind of transforms as it ages. And this is a final image of the rainbow that we mentioned and that we had as a goal for this project. When the mist system is on at certain times of day, basically a double rainbow would encase all of the people who would visit the project. So then it was time for the programming. We had a number of programs that were all free to the public, and our program partners who stuck with us for about a 6 and 7 month process were there to support us and help the community go through these different projects. The first, outside of the project, the program where Dana and I did a walk and talk and kind of discussed our project as we're doing now, we also had a sound bath, which was like the opening of the project. And we had Dr. Kisha Campbell come and do a sound bath and very like enriching and reviving experience. There was also a movement day. So we had yoga with Sonia Ohm, and we had a somatic movement workshop with Ajani Branham. And if you pay attention to all of the photos as we go throughout time, you'll see the evolution of the interior. We also hosted a New Way of Life, and they did a program which is basically a living library where they worked with women who were formerly incarcerated, and they get to tell their stories. That same day, there was a Dear People affirmations with the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective, also known as BEAM. And they had different signs posted about affirmations, whether it be about Dear Black trans folks, Dear Black folks, Dear Black women. Another program that we hosted was a TFR with the artist April Banks, who is a LA-based artist who hosts conversations that also include tea and light snacks. And these conversations bring out community and bring out experiences. And this is a part of her artistic practice, is bringing communities together in basically recreating a Southern front porch. We also hosted a land acknowledgement, which was a Native American land acknowledgement with Zoe Toledo. And this was kind of a jointure between our project, Black Steel, and the next M&A project, which will be created by Native American artists and architects. Deluge was an additional program that we hosted. And Deluge is very interesting because it is super community oriented, because we had no plans of hosting an ambient music event. But during the first couple of weeks of the project being open, we were approached by some young men, and they were basically like, we're artists, we're curators, and we want to create this event called Deluge. It'll be an ambient music event. And they basically set everything up and coordinated with the museum so that they could host their inaugural event in our space. So it was really an honor to kind of create this space and then have other artists understand the space and want to be involved in bringing enrichment like music. So we have a video from the Deluge event, and I'll show a couple seconds from that video. And then also, as the video goes through, it not only captures the event and all the people who attended the event, but it also showcases our installation. Yeah, so there were DJs that played different music, artists who created their own music and soundtracks in a very meditative manner and in a meditative space. It was probably one of the events where you will find the most people in the interior of Black Steel. There is also a poetry reading from a popular poet in Los Angeles. You can also see this is pretty deep into our calendar. So the walls of the interior are super populated with these fabric strips. But it was a great event. There were people inside, outside, there was dancing, a lot of joy. Super family friendly, a lot of kids, and there was a lot of people who came out, especially in the LA artist community. And here you can see just some shots of the portal, and that was Deluge. And then our final programs, we had a meditation with Jelani Ma'at, a local LA meditation practitioner, who brought meditation seats for us to sit on and guided us with music and scent and feel. So then the final event was a restorative justice workshop with the Center for Restorative Justice. And they also work with incarcerated people and hold conversations specifically around restorative justice and how do we as a community create methods and moments for restorative justice. For the closing of Black Steel, we wanted to end on a celebratory note, so we hosted the Black Market Day. And in this program, we had a day of vendors and food. There were people who sold body products, jewelry. Of course, with the Craft Contemporary, we had artists there who did ceramics as well. And then we also hosted this event with DJs. So it was a very celebratory and fun sort of event.
Thank you, Megan. So in conclusion, some of the things that we learned from this process was probably first and foremost that the community's feedback is essential from conceptualization through the design and realization. We also think it was really critical and important for us to identify which stakeholders, which community members were going to be the people that we were designing for. We also acknowledged that while we were designing for Black Los Angelenos, that they were not the only people who'd be occupying this space. And so how do we create a space that's open to others, that's friendly, that's welcoming? It was really important for us to think about community buy-in and stewardship, not only through the project financing, but sort of through its construction. That sweat equity to kind of keep our costs down was essential for us to be able to build it. And it was also just a great opportunity for us to build educational opportunities for members of the community as well as M&A's community. And then the idea of creating this programming calendar for community events, both planned and impromptu, I think was a really beautiful opportunity to see how engaging the architecture through time and through activities and through engagement with each other was really important to develop a sense of community, to develop notions of wellness practices for people who may or may not have that exposure prior. And probably the last thing was that we just had to get our hands dirty. We were not expecting when we got the call initially that we would need to do so much of the work ourselves, but to see the work get built, we had to get our hands dirty. We had to do the financing. We had to have the calls with the contractors. We had to literally do the nails and hammering and get the volunteer schedules, and have a few late nights or two. But I think all of that together made the project quite beautiful, and I think proved to us that this project is only an example of future projects to come and other ways in which we as designers can use community first, or lean on our community members first before we sort of just go right into the design of the project. We just want to say thank you so much for participating with us today. We welcome any questions that you have. We would love for you to reach out to us. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I will start with some questions from the audience. This is a great project with such little time. How was the experience with working with Builder Bee?
Oh, it was wonderful. So Bianca Ray is the owner and operator of Builder Bee. It's definitely a family-run, family-owned business. And it was funny when we first got to the site, or actually our first meeting with them. We met her two dads, and we said, "Your two dads," and her stepdad and her father are both employees, and her like play dad. So it was great to be able to work with a local, especially a Black woman-owned contracting company who herself is trying to upstart. And so it was a really collaborative approach. She had never done a project like this before. They do a lot of residential architecture in Los Angeles County. And then working with them to do value engineering, to talk about some of the decisions we were making, and right sizing things. So like initially we were going to do 16 feet tall, and one of the fathers was like, "How tall are you?" And I was like, "I'm 5'2". And so, having to maybe make some adjustments just based off of our own like physical capacity to build. And they were so supportive. They came to a bunch of the events, and we've stayed in touch since. So absolutely wonderful.
That's such a fantastic experience. What are the opportunities, if any, available to the public if folks want to be part of these types of ongoing initiatives?
It's always like a great resource if you have something like materials and applications in your community. So if you have any kind of like architecture, and initially we got involved with this project, or were approached by this project because of Dana's experience when she lived in LA. She was just involved with materials and applications as a person, like working on the board or volunteering at events. So if there are any kind of like architecture related or even like Habitat Humanity sort of things that are in your community that you're keeping an eye out for, there are always opportunities to build. And then, of course, there's always like creating those opportunities to build things and get your hands dirty and have a lot of fun.
Thank you. This one is a direct quote. "This is so dope. Love the wellness component, leaving something behind for liberation. How much programming does craft provide in your space? Has the space been well received by the community?"
So and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, this was a temporary installation. So it was really only open between May of 2023 and September of 2023. So it did have about a 5-month stint, and it was really well received. It was funny because we built a rapport with a lot of the craft staff, and we would go back and forth across country and meet up with them. And one of them said, a lot of people just go to the installation not knowing what it is, but to kind of get shade, to sit down and to rest. And so they were really thankful that we actually had an exterior space for them. And so they also said that they just ate their lunches in there. And so I think that was a really great relationship we were able to build. But I do think, moreover, I think that people in the community were really invested in the piece. I know there's been some ongoing conversations about whether we build it somewhere else. I had some students of mine at Harvard who asked about possibly doing another iteration of it. So I think it was really successful in that regard.
And then as far as the programming, Craft already kind of has a schedule of programs, and what we were bringing in was basically our own programs that we added to their program schedule. And typically, I think projects in the past maybe had a lot less programming, but I think we were super excited and super ambitious and saw this as like a benefit to the community. And if we could make it work, we made it work. So a lot of the programs that we saw, we had like 2 a day kind of thing to be able to fit those things into a summer calendar.
Sometimes redesign or re-architecting an existing network management process introduces risk and unforeseen outcomes. How can this be mitigated so the endpoints are not affected adversely?
I mean, I think for us, a lot of it has to do with how we are building our stakeholders or how we are identifying and building sort of our stakeholder network. I think a lot of the risk when you have a community informed design process is that you are opening yourself up for feedback that you may or may not want to hear or that you may or may not be ready to respond to, or that the feedback in itself might conflict with one another. And so I think for us, it was really important to build sort of a rapport with the different groups that we were engaging, also to allow for a mixing of conversations. So it was like, while we did kind of have somewhat siloed conversations at the beginning, as we move further along in the design process and even in the construction process, we were bringing different constituents together. And I think by having a sort of a shared, approach, a shared understanding of where we were trying to go towards, I think that helped to reduce a lot of the potential conflicts that could have resolved. I think just kind of building those communities is important.
What are some small and large scale ways we can apply these things, such as yoga, stillness, healing, into busy and stressful environments like common spaces at colleges, universities, especially those in the heart of urban areas?
Yeah, I think that's like a really good idea and good notion, as well as a good question. Um, I mean, it starts probably with what Dana was saying. It starts with conversation. Um, of course, there's always an option to do things in kind of a guerrilla way and just, ask for permission after the fact. So, whether that be like setting up a really comfy chair in your workspace or creating a space of reconcile if you have one of your own in a public space. Or I even like to think of like people who set up those little free libraries as kind of setting up a space for, a time to slow down and think and read. And even though we're like in this super stressful time where we have to keep going and going and going. So, I mean, part of it on maybe a larger scale is having conversations with people and saying like, hey, I really want to do this thing, and getting other people involved and excited about that. But then on a smaller scale, any like small spaces you have, like even for me, I think like planting flowers or having a lovely garden or a simple window box or something like that, you can create spaces for pause or spaces where people can gather around these different ideas around nature, especially now that the weather is nice, especially for those of you in Boston, where you can like just sit down and relax and contemplate how you feel.
I would also just add that finding or being flexible as to where what spaces you're activating. And so at the Graduate School of Design, for example, we have these classrooms, which are called the porticos, which are transformed into a yoga studio twice a week. And we, as an institution, invite yoga practitioner to come in and work with our students. For free classes that they can go to at I think they're 7 o'clock on like a Monday and a Wednesday, to do yoga and to facilitate that. There's a little bit of coordination with the janitorial staff, but they clear the room, they push all the furniture to the side or take it out of the room, and then students come flooding in. And it's just a way for them to have yoga without even having to like leave the building. And so I think sometimes using your spaces creatively is also important because you don't always have the space to expand or to build upon. So that's helpful.
Aside from running into issues around space, the hot LA sun, and of course, funding for this project, what other challenges did you both run into that sort of slowed down the process of design for this installment?
I would say funding was probably, I mean, I know that was mentioned as one of the things, but funding was probably the biggest issue. We also, I think, because we initially, I guess, we saw the site, I think, January of 2022, and it was still early enough in the pandemic where I think there's a lot of or sort of a fatigue from Zoom world, from the board of M&A, from the museum, and there was a lot of uncertainty. And so I think we had to re-energize people in a way that we hadn't anticipated upon our initial engagement. And that meant like talking to board members directly, talking to the staff of the museum, putting out like a lot of content on social media to kind of excite people enough to like, one, help us get to push the funding along, but also to help us in sort of the structuring of, the construction time frame, getting it on the calendar. And so I think there were maybe some structural barriers in that capacity. But Megan, I'm not sure if you have any others.
Yeah, we also like ran into more hiccups, during the build. We did not have a lot of space and we didn't have a lot of time. LA is an urban area, so we were working with a small museum, so we didn't have a lot of storage space. We only had a couple days, like the material needed to come that day that it was scheduled, and it needs to be put in place the day that it was scheduled. And we definitely had to work with some additional methods of shipping to get some of our materials to the site and actually get those put in place before basically the Craft Contemporary had a very large opening event for everything that was going on in the museum. So it's being persistent and rolling with the punches and understanding like this is what we have to do and making it happen.
I'll just quickly add, we had one particularly late night where our installation didn't arrive it was supposed to arrive 2 days prior, and it was time to install the installation because the next day the museum was opening. And we were using our phone flashlights to literally install insulation until like 2 o'clock in the morning with the help of the M&A executive director and her partner. And so like I think required some flexibility in all of our parts, just given, pandemic delays and just general issues you would approach on a site. But the time was really, really, really consolidated.
And this will be the last question. How do you both incorporate dynamics of an ever-changing climate alongside community-centered voices in the design profession, in the perspective of architects, urban planners, engineers, landscape architects, etc.?
I think it's a very important part of my process as an individual designer, or like something that I really care about a lot. And I think even for this project, it's something that we try to keep in consideration when we were building this, knowing that we were building something that would be there for a short time. We were definitely grateful to receive some materials. We use like a hemp-based insulation, which is, much easier on the earth and easier on our lungs, using something that is naturally made and something that would biodegrade. Another thing that we did was we used like the rubber mulch that we use, we ended up donating that because we knew like, okay, we're only going to have this material for a couple of months. We ended up donating it to an actual playground. So it's looking at not only the things that you're working with and the time period that you're working with, but like what will be the end life cycle for those different materials that you're incorporating as far as being more eco-conscious and considering global warming.
I think we also approach the project through the lens of community-informed design, that it was a bit different from, especially when we were looking for bids from contractors and fabricators and from different material providers. It was just a different conversation than they were used to. And I think other practices are starting to do similar things. And so I think the tradition of building in itself is starting to transition. But it was a bit of a process, I think, in trying to get people on board. And then also just like identifying and being very upfront about what our values were in the promotion of wellness, the promotion of Blackness. We also worked with a Black photographer who he did like architecture or real estate photography, never done art or photography. But being a little bit more intentional in the way that we approached it, and saying, no matter what, we were going to stick by our values.
Thank you, Dana and Megan, and thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us for more signature events this fall. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal-events. Thank you all and have a lovely evening.